Last time, we talked about the beginnings of human civilization, starting with the agricultural revolution that permitted people to settle places instead of having to hunt and gather and nomadically wander the earth and search for food. And we learned about some of the first civilizations, specifically in Mesopotamia and in Egypt. So today we are going to continue learning about ancient civilizations, mostly focusing on five. First, we're going to go through ancient India, then ancient China, followed by Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. So this will lead us up to what's called the classical era, which is basically ancient Greece and Rome, which we will talk about next time. So first, ancient India. The Indus Valley Civilization. This formed along the Indus River on the border of modern-day India and Pakistan. It existed from 3000 to 1750 BC, which is around the same time as Old and Middle Kingdom Egypt, as well as the same time as the founding of Israel. Now, the Indus Valley Civilization did not have any form of writing, and therefore we don't know as much about it as we do about ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, the Fertile Crescent region. It was much farther away from it. If you look on the map here, this is the Fertile Crescent, and you have the Indus Valley Civilization way over here. But because they don't have any writing, all we know about it is from artifacts. But artifacts aren't useless. You can still learn a lot. You can deduce a lot about a culture from its artifacts. For example, no weapons have been found in any of the excavated cities that we've dug in the Indus Valley Civilization, and this can imply that the Indus Valley Civilization was much more peaceful, was likely more peaceful than the Mesopotamian or Egyptian civilizations, which had used bronze and metal, and before that stone, to make weapons to fight with each other. The Indus Valley Civilization also did not trade. They were pretty isolated. They did not levy taxes on their people. The government did not do that. But one important development that happened in the Indus Valley was Hinduism was formed, one of the most ancient religions in the world. We already learned about Judaism, another one of the most ancient religions in the world, and now we're going to learn about Hinduism. So Hinduism dates back to about 3,500 years ago. Hindus believe that there are many gods, which means they are polytheistic. This is different from Judaism, which is monotheistic, which means there's just one God. Now, as far as how many gods Hindu believes in, it really varies from person to person and from group to group. If you research how many gods do Hindus believe in, you'll get answers anywhere from 3 to 330 million. So it really is quite varied. It's the most complicated religion in the world. It's very difficult to wrap your mind around, but it does have a lot of followers. About 1 billion people on Earth today practice Hinduism, mostly in India. The sacred texts of Hinduism includes the Vedas and the Bhagavad Gita. And among other things, these texts teach that the soul of a person is reincarnated after death. That's one of the key elements of Hinduism, that after you die, your soul comes back and inhabits another being. So you become another person or perhaps an animal. And the type of being that your soul inhabits after your death is determined by your behavior in your previous life. And this is the idea of karma. You probably heard people talk about karma, like what goes around comes around. If you're good to somebody, then you'll get some good karma and something good will happen to you. Well, that's kind of similar to the original definition of karma, which goes back to Hinduism. They say that if you lived a good and righteous life, then you will come back as a wealthy person or maybe a prince. But if you lived a bad life and you were bad to people, you might come back as an impoverished person or maybe even a lowly animal like a slug or a cockroach. And it's believed that your soul is reincarnated many times until eventually it's liberated from the cycle of life and death. And from the Vedas comes what they call in India the caste system. And this is a social hierarchy. Most civilizations had a social hierarchy, which we'll learn about. But this one, the caste system, is very rigid, meaning whatever social class or whatever caste you are born into, that is your caste for life. Whatever you were born into, you can't move out of it. If you were born poor, you have to stay in that caste. And this has really trapped hundreds of millions of Indians in poverty over the centuries. And the reason why this is seen as justifiable is because of the idea of reincarnation and karma. Because Hindus think that if you are born into a lowly caste, that must mean that you did something bad in a previous life, therefore you deserve the poverty you get, and we shouldn't try to help you get out of it. Ancient China. Chinese history goes back more than 4,000 years. Now, starting around 2000 BC, the Chinese established dynasties, the dynastic system of government, and that remained their form of government for about 4,000 years, all the way until the year 1911. And a dynasty is basically an emperor and his family, so ruling families ruled the country. And sometimes dynasties would be overthrown and replaced with new dynasties. So it's not like there was one ruling family for 4,000 years. Oftentimes, dynasties would be overthrown, they would fall from power, and new governments, new dynasties would overtake them. And emperors had this issue of, how do I legitimize my power? And that's really an issue that a lot of rulers have throughout history. I mean, how do you convince the millions of people, potentially, who are under your rule, that you are actually in charge? How do you prevent them from rebelling against you? Well, there are a lot of ways that rulers have legitimized their power. Some have done so through architecture, by building massive, beautiful buildings dedicated to them and their glory. That might convince someone who walks by it that, hey, whoever built that, they must be in charge. They must have the real power. And then others use force, and then still other rulers use religion to legitimize their power. And that's what the Chinese emperors did. They legitimized their power by claiming to have the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven is basically the blessing of the gods. They believe that it is the will of the gods and the royal ancestors that they be the emperor. And as evidence for that, they were born into the ruling family. Now, in the event of revolutions or other kind of destabilizing disasters, it was then interpreted that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, and therefore the people had a right to overthrow them. And in order to avoid this, the emperor's goal was political stability. Every emperor had the same goal. They wanted to maintain a stable kingdom. And one person who had a lot to say about political stability and how to achieve it is a Chinese philosopher named Confucius. He lived during a period called the Warring States period, and as you can probably deduce from the name, it was not a very stable time in ancient Chinese history. So he occupied his mind with thinking, how can one construct and maintain an orderly, peaceful, smoothly run society? And what can each individual person do to do their part to make that happen? And he came down to the conclusion that in order to have a peaceful, stable society, people need to respect authority and practice filial piety. Filial piety means being a good member of your family. So if you're a child, filial piety means obeying your parents no matter what. And if you are a mother or a father, filial piety means caring for your children, protecting them, putting them before you, no matter what. So his philosophy, known as Confucianism, became and still remains a really popular way of life and religion in China. So it really has two parts. Number one would be Confucius's philosophy of social order and morally upright behavior. And the second part of Confucianism is ancestor veneration. So ancestors, elders, people who have passed on, they are venerated or revered. If you think veneration, think maybe one level below worship. Not technically worshipped, but very much respected and revered and looked to for wisdom. Later dynasties would establish a civil service exam. This was a test that people could take, and it was entirely based on Confucius's teachings. You would study his philosophy for years, and then you would take the civil service exam. And if you did well on the civil service exam, you could earn a place in the government. You could earn a high rank in society. So this is very different from the caste system because this is an example of upward mobility. You could earn a higher place in society, whereas in ancient India, you could not. And what this is called is a meritocracy. Merit means earn, and if you can earn something, earn a higher place in a society, that is called a meritocracy. And whenever you're just given things based on where you are, what family you are born into, that is called aristocracy. During the Han Dynasty, which was around 100 BC, the Chinese invented paper, they invented the kite, and they invented silk, which became their dominant trade item for centuries. During the Tang Dynasty, which was later on, about 600 AD, a group of Chinese alchemists, who are basically fake chemists who try to concoct different elements or maybe change certain elements into gold or make elixirs for immortality, something like that. While they were trying to do this, they unintentionally created gunpowder. As the legend goes, they were trying to make a potion that would make you immortal if you drank it, and while it was cooking in the cauldron exploded, and they inadvertently created gunpowder. And this was first used to make fireworks and later to make bombs and guns and things like that. They also invented the toothbrush. They invented all sorts of things that really altered world history. So only the final 4 dynasties of Chinese history are covered in the AP World History curriculum. Those are going to be the Song Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty, the Ming, and the Qing dynasties. And those are going to be the ones covered later on in the year. Buddhism was one of the driving forces in really Asian history at this point. A lot of people think of China when they think of Buddhism, and Buddhism is certainly big in China, but it actually started in India, and it spread to Nepal, Bhutan, really that whole region of southern and eastern Asia. It was started by a man named Siddhartha Gautama, and he lived around the same time as Confucius, but he lived in modern-day India and Nepal, whereas Confucius lived in China. And Siddhartha Gautama tried to understand why suffering exists. And that's a really good question. It's probably something you have wondered before. Why do human beings have to suffer? Why is this something that even exists? And how can we reduce our suffering and other people's suffering in the world? It's a really good question. And Buddha, as he called himself, the Buddha, or the Enlightened One, after he meditated on this question for a very long time, he became enlightened on this subject. And this is where Siddhartha Gautama earned the nickname or the title of the Buddha, which means the Enlightened One. So the conclusion he came to is that the reason why people suffer is because of desires and expectations that they have. And the logic behind this is that if you desire something, that is necessarily going to bring about suffering, because if you don't get it, you'll be very disappointed, very disheartened. And if you do, then you might just have greater desires that will then ultimately be disappointed and cause you to be very depressed or maybe worried that it might not come to fruition. But he said, if you completely rid yourself of all desires and you have no expectations out of life whatsoever, then he said you won't suffer, because every time pain will come to you, you won't have expected a lack of pain to come to you. One example would be the desire that all of us have to look good. Okay, we all have that desire. I do, you do. We all want to look okay. The Buddha said that in order to get rid of that desire, you should maybe shave your head, okay? So you see Buddhist monks in the picture there. They shave their head. They put on robes. That way, they don't have that desire to look nice with fancy new clothes or have a nice haircut or anything like that. And slowly, the Buddha said, through meditation, reflection, refraining from all earthly pleasures, because that brings about desire, he said that one could free oneself from all desires and therefore remove all suffering from one's life. And he said that this state of peaceful bliss that would follow enlightenment, as he called, was called nirvana. And nirvana is basically a state where your soul is released from reincarnation and you are at peace and kind of cease to exist as an individual, but only exist in the larger cosmos. And monasteries were built for this purpose. Monasteries, those are places where monks live and they devote their entire lives to religion. Christianity has monasteries too. Christians have monks as well, and monasteries are where they reside. Now, while Hinduism has some similarities to Buddhism in some practices, Buddhism rejected other parts of Hinduism. For example, it rejected the caste system because it said it caused people to desire to have a higher caste, and it also rejected the Hindu scriptures. And this caused Buddhism to spread very rapidly throughout Asia, especially among the poor, because if you're poor, you're going to be much more likely to find comfort in Buddhism than Hinduism, because Buddhism doesn't believe in the caste system. Now getting to ancient Assyria. So back to the Fertile Crescent region, we last left off with the decline of New Kingdom Egypt. So when New Kingdom Egypt declined in the Fertile Crescent, the next empire to take its place was Assyria. Now, Assyria, officially known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, it was the most powerful force in the Middle East from around 1000 to 700 BC. A couple of things about them: they were very ruthless in war. They were known for brutal tactics like impaling, which is where you shove a spike through somebody's body and stick it in the ground and make them hang there till they die. Just really barbaric practices like that. However, on the more positive side, once the Assyrians did conquer an area, they rebuilt it. They reinvested in those cities, so if you were lucky enough to escape impaling, you usually were in pretty good shape in the city that the Assyrians conquered. Now remember talking about the Israelites. Remember Abraham, he was from around here in the city of Ur, U-R, and in probably around 2000 BC, he traveled along the Fertile Crescent to the area of Canaan right here, established a people group now known as Hebrews or Jews. They then went to Egypt, were enslaved here for several hundred years, and then went back to this region and established a kingdom. Well, about 100 years after that, around 900 BC, this kingdom split into two. The northern half was called Israel, and the southern half was called Judah. Well, Assyria, in the year 722 BC, they conquered the northern half here. They conquered Israel. They allowed Judah to continue to exist, but they conquered Israel, wiped it off the map, and the residents of Israel were then exiled to Assyria. They were brought back to Assyria, the capital city of Nineveh, the greatest city in the world at the time. They were exiled there for the foreseeable future. Now, this left the southern half of Israel, now known as Judah, it left them alone with several powers all around them. But one lesson from history is that no empire lasts forever. So while Assyria was very powerful for a time, there was another empire that rose to prominence, Babylon, that came to conquer Assyria. And this happened from 612 to 609 BC, where Nineveh and the rest of Assyria was conquered by the Babylonians. And then Babylon replaced Assyria as the leading power in the region. So what about Babylon? Well, Babylon was ruled by King Nebuchadnezzar II during their height of power, and this was from 605 through 562 BC. A couple things about him: he owned and designed one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. If you've ever heard of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, that includes the Great Pyramid of Giza, for example. And the one that Nebuchadnezzar made was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And this no longer exists. In fact, all of the 7 wonders of the ancient world have now crumbled or been destroyed, except for the Great Pyramid at Giza. So back to Nebuchadnezzar. In the year 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon invaded and conquered Judah. So Judah had been existing for about 150 years by itself since the northern kingdom of Israel had been invaded by the Assyrians. So the Babylonians besieged the capital city of Jerusalem. That means to surround a city and not let anyone in or out, and basically starve them out and then attack them when they're weak. So that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. They destroyed the city of Jerusalem, including the famous Temple of Solomon, which was said to be one of the largest and most ornate and gorgeous buildings in world history. So Babylon wasn't so big on impaling like the Assyrians were, but at the same time, they did not reinvest or rebuild the cities that they conquered. So Jerusalem was left in ruins for decades, and the remaining Jews who survived the invasion, they were then taken captive. They were taken as captives back to Babylon, where previous Jewish people were captives of the Assyrians. But, as I said, no empire lasts forever. And in fact, Babylon's reign was fairly short-lived, because in the year 539 BC, here comes Persia. All right, Persia, led by Cyrus the Great, conquered Babylon, and then Persia became the major power in the region. And final slide for today, Persia, under the leadership of Cyrus, was actually very consequential in world history. So Cyrus, known as Cyrus the Great, truly was a great leader. Under his leadership, Persia conquered most of the Middle East, really everywhere from Greece to the border of India. And Persia, known as the Achaemenid Empire, if you're interested, this became the first government in history to give its people freedom of religion. Now, freedom of religion is something we take for granted in America, that we can believe whatever we believe and not be persecuted for it, not be jailed or killed for it. But throughout most of world history, people did not have freedom of religion. You pretty much had to believe, or at least pretend you believed, whatever the ruler said you did. But Cyrus didn't believe in that. He said, even though he was a Zoroastrian, he said that people should have the freedom to worship as they see fit. So he gave his people freedom of religion, first government in history to do so. He also abolished slavery, which was super unique. Pretty much every civilization in all of human history until very recently has had some form of slavery. And then he also granted freedom to all displaced minorities in Persia, including the Jews who had been captives in Assyria and Babylon for centuries at this point. So he allowed them to return to their homeland of Canaan, return and rebuild Jerusalem, and he was seen as a savior for that reason. Cyrus also built the first high-quality road system in the world, and this would later be emulated or copied by the Romans. Persia remained the dominant empire in the region until about 330 BC, when they, like much of the rest of the world, was conquered by Greece, led by Alexander the Great, who we will talk about next time.